Get ready to listen, learn, and earn CE hours. This podcast features content from an accredited CE activity provided by Colibri Healthcare. Visit elitelearning.com/podcasts for accreditation and disclosure statements and instructions on how you may be able to earn CE credits.
Just our jobs alone are one of giving, and that there's a collective suffering with humanity right now in terms of trauma, really receiving secondary trauma from our patients and still trying to balance it all with our family and personal lives.
Hello, everyone. My name is Leanna McGuire, and I will be your host for this Elite Learning podcast series, Boundaries and Burnout, Strategies for Nurses to Maintain Self, a course originally published by Elite Learning in video format. Throughout the 2 episodes provided in this course, we will hear from Trish Hart. She is a highly skilled stress management educator and facilitator of mind-body workshops, lectures, training retreats, and events on a wide range of wellness and mental health topics. She inspires individuals to thrive in both physical and emotional performance. As you heard in the introduction, there is a lot going on in our personal and professional lives, and finding balance is a challenge. Let's listen now as Trish provides more on this topic.
My name is Trish Hart, and I am from the healthcare world from the age of 15 years old. I've been working in healthcare, beginning as a candy striper all the way through the patient care side, landing from finance into mind-body medicine. I have a lot of education in this field, including some work with Duke Integrative Medicine, with mindfulness, and do quite a bit of lecturing on these topics that really manage stress using the tools of mind-body medicine, and also have an MBA from Boston University, and just really enjoy being here on the patient care side and all that we can do for ourselves, working with anxiety, depression, trauma, addiction, grief, and burnout being kind of the resulting factor from many of these things. Let's get started. The goal is to discover the power of the relaxation response that each of us have, and find different tools for understanding how all of the facets that are within us can really help alleviate burnout. And we catch ourselves knowing that when we're starting to head down that pathway, that we have some tools. Today, the objectives of this workshop are the following: describing the contributors and risks of burnout, analyzing the impact of stress and burnout on our physical and emotional state, and adopting strategies for setting boundaries in our professional and our personal lives. And this becomes even more important, especially with nurses. You know that we work with so much compassion for others, and often we find ourselves at a loss of compassion for ourselves. And that, we've been through quite a journey over this past 15 to 16 month period with, working with COVID, but on top of that, just our jobs alone are one of giving. And that there's a collective suffering with humanity right now in terms of trauma, really receiving secondary trauma from our patients and still trying to balance it all with our family and personal lives. So knowing that, these objectives are great ones, because it's even more important right now to our nursing profession, because there are 4 million nurses in the United States as of right now, and 1/3 of those nurses, according to JAMA, they cite burnout as a reason for leaving the profession. And at this moment is when we need nurses and nurse leaders to be even stronger.
A staggering statistic: 4 million nurses, with 1/3 leaving the profession due to burnout. Let's pause for a moment to reflect on that.
Having a state of balance and well-being, the ability to care for others starts with the ability to care for ourselves. So really being mindful about how widespread burnout is, and a little bit deeper in terms of that agenda, going in and taking a peek at what are the causes of burnout and what are the dangers once nurses become burnt out. There are some structural stages to burnout where we identify the symptoms, and there's a whole amazing neurophysiology of how stress and burnout wreak havoc in our brains and our nervous systems. So from there, we're going to branch forward into discovering some healthy habits for recovery and how to prevent burnout, and some valuable takeaways as well. So we have lots on the docket today. And as I mentioned, burnout is a real phenomenon. And according to the World Health Organization, burnout is an occupational phenomenon, and it's not just for nursing. There are many different causes of burnout and growing demand, how we're really working with an increase in prevalence of disease. And the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics project that employment for nurses, registered nurses, will grow 12% between 2018 and 2028. So knowing that there's growing pains associated with this, understaffed hospitals, overworked nurses, and burnout. In addition to that, the shifts are long, and there was just so much ambiguity of exactly what a shift would be. So knowing that burnout is 2.5 times more common in nurses that work 10 to 13-hour shifts versus 8 to 9 shifts. Another cause of burnout is the obvious lack of sleep. And, overall in the industry, there is a chronic lack of sleep. And it's particularly noted with nurses that work long hours and consecutive shifts. And in a study conducted by Cronus Inc., 25% nurses reported that they were unable to get enough sleep between their shifts. So all of these things wreak havoc in terms of work quality. But it's the environment of what it is. It is what it is. There's a lot of big decisions, life and death decisions, working with time constraints, lots of anxiety, calming others, a lot of giving here. So the high stress of the profession alone has its challenges, but some specialties within it naturally are even more stressful, including working in the ER or an ICU or oncology nurses, where you're working so much with anticipatory grief in patients, supporting families, and not always knowing, obviously what the outcomes for these patients are. Now, in addition to that, another factor causing nurse burnout is the emotional strain from patient care that's, related to this. And knowing that nurses are in this profession for a reason. You're here to give. You're here to take care of people and make connections. And you gain satisfaction when you help them feel better. So, but if you work in critical or end-of-life care, those emotional letdowns of dealing with lower recovery rates and higher mortality can lead to compassion fatigue, a secondary trauma. So we also, as nurses, also receive trauma from that aspect. So making sure that, the risk of burnout is decreased as we move through these channels of giving care. But no more than anything, what's important too is that we have support. So a cause of nursing burnout is a lack of support, whether it's through physicians or support team or administration, that if we don't have that support to do our jobs well in terms of regulating our sleep schedules, the length of our shifts, and also our patient care ratios, we put ourselves more at risk for burnout. So there are a lot of implications, kind of like a ripple effect of nursing burnout. The first one is high turnover, given a shortage of nurses right now. And in a study by the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, researchers found that there's a correlation between higher rates of burnout syndrome and nurses' intention to leave. So this high increased turnout then puts more stress on an already overworked environment. So that's critical that we note that there is a true implication on burnout and for turnover and shortage, given we're working with, we need even more nurses at this particular point. Now, lower quality of care, patient care, is another dangerous risk associated with burnout. And as the quality of care decreases, mistakes are made due to exhaustion, and that can lead to patient discomfort, infection, and in some instances, even death. One study found that patients of nurses experiencing burnout had an increased incidence of urinary tract infections and surgical site infections.
Nurses are leaving the profession, as Trish mentioned earlier. Now we're also hearing about the impact of burnout on patient outcomes.
Increased mortality is another major danger of nursing burnout. In a study by Marshall University, the nurse-to-patient ratios greater than 1:4 were not only correlated with higher percentages of burnout, but for each patient added to the ratio, there was a 7% increase in mortality. A 7% increase in mortality just by shifting that patient care ratio. So how do we stay strong away from providing a bubble, insulating ourselves from burnout? Boundaries could not be any more important, because boundaries honor and respect our own needs and the needs of those around us. Now, burnout is defined as a psychological syndrome emerging as a prolonged response to chronic interpersonal stressors on the job. Now, we know that burnout is real, and it's actually a costly industry. There was an estimate from 2018 that the physical and psychological problems of burned out employees cost between $125 billion to $190 billion a year in healthcare spending. So boundaries can provide really strong lines to help prevent and alleviate burnout. And we've all been there. We all have that boss that might pop in, when we least expect it. On vacation, we answer the phone. We say yes to extra shifts and extra hours. And the only one that suffers is us to begin with. But then we see that there is a ripple effect in terms of the quality of care that we are providing to our patients. So just this year alone, it's been overall in all industries such a shift in terms of how many hours we're working, how much sitting we're doing, working with the technology of Zoom for those that are administration, especially knowing that working differently has certainly happened. But in addition to that, the boundaries have become blurred in terms of home life and work life. Many of us find ourselves at home taking care of, our children who are home during the the pandemic phase, older adults, et cetera, our parents, things like that, being sandwiched. And know that, we always have stress in our world, but stress is a leading cause of 80 to 90% of visits to primary care physicians. So just the shift with COVID on top of an already strained industry profession has really affected, causing that one third percentage of overall nurses stating that they felt burnt out. So know that, burnout is something that we can feel and something that we can tangibly see in terms of our physical bodies. According to WebMD, the average person gained 8 pounds over the past 16 months, in spite of the surge of on-demand exercise content. So stress management really became an issue. Self-care, even though the content was out there, people didn't use it. So if you think about burnout, it's a reduction. It's a reduction of fuel or substance to nothing. So if you think about a candle, we start so bright. And if we were together, I would light a candle and say, this is what we look like pre-burnout. But over time, that light becomes less and less bright. And, that we truly do wither away so that we're not as effective. And that is the phenomenon that happens when we give and give and give, and our inner resources are depleted, that there's no spark to light again, to start up again. So when family life then collides with work life, it's a persistent energy burn, and that the path to refilling our supply, to resilience isn't always clear.
Many nurses were definitely impacted by the pandemic. Now that we might be on the other side of COVID, we're finding that many are suffering from its lingering effects, including post-traumatic stress disorder. Trish will now speak to the potential for addressing this outcome through the act of setting boundaries.
So, as we start to think about how do we do this? How do we create strong boundaries? Well, know that, if we were in a room together, I'd ask how many of you have a fence in your yard, because fences can be fantastic physical boundaries about what's important to us. What's in our yard. In olden times, historical times, fences kept livestock in, and they marked property. And if they weren't in place, can you just imagine? So the far right, depicts what happens if things aren't in place. All chaos breaks loose. So they also allow us privacy, and that's meaningful and important. And that's really what burnout does. What is meaningful, fences do. What's meaningful and important to us stays in, and what we don't want to have enter into our world stays out. It's something that's apparent in nature. We see it with cell membranes. We see it with crustaceans, nautilus shells, that there's some firm boundaries about the environment and its implications on the inside organism. But, in addition to this, that, the boundaries are really determined when we are very young. It's something that's passed down through our parents, and that some of us have these really loose fences or no fences or very strong fences. So if you think about your personality, that kind of says a lot about how you keep your boundaries from letting everything collide. So there's 3 personalities, and basically, someone that doesn't have a door, a gate on their fence, or a very short fence, has what's known as a passive personality, a people pleaser, a welcome mat. And more likely, those are the people that are to be burnt out. They're always saying yes, and that the worlds collide quite often between personal and work life. On the other hand, there's someone that's opening the gate and coming in and asking people to go beyond their boundaries, asking people to stay later, maybe extending a shift, or again, about working with a patient care ratio. Those are the people that are aggressive. So they're the ones that are asking for those extra, pushing the boundaries. But what we're trying to do is to find what is known as the assertive personality, that we have, what is meaningful and important to us stays in, that we stand up for ourselves, and that we have these boundaries in place that protect us and protect our energy. And that's really what it comes down to, is our energy. We only have so much to give, and we want to give it in a meaningful way. So as we start to move forward, understanding, when we have too much stress, we have an energy leak, and that energy leak leads us down the pathway to burnout. So this is a great depiction that can really sum up how we work with stress. And stress is that very first piece. So in this bell curve, the axes are the performance and stress level. So it's showing us that on the far left side of this bell curve is when we don't have any stress, that we have we don't have a purpose. We're purposeless, that we are an active bored. But as the stress starts to increase, our performance starts to increase till we get to the very center, which is known as peak performance. Everything is in balance. We're able to manage our stress. We have some meaningful work. We're feeling great. Our body is also reflective of this peak performance, and all the systems of our body are what's known as homeostasis. But what happens is, as stress increases, we start to slide down that far right side. And what it's showing us is that, overall, the more the stress increases, the less we are able to deal with the stress, re-regulate, so that we move into chronic stress. And in this area of chronic stress is when we're overloaded, we start to become fatigued and exhausted. We might notice a breakdown in our mental health, where anxiety and panic and anger begin to step in. And the end result is burnout and breakdown. So this particular depiction was developed back in 1908. So this has really been studied for quite some time. And it's really interesting that, everybody goes through a balancing act between stress, and relaxation, freedom, where we give our energy. Even Arianna Huffington, who is a very successful journalist and author and entrepreneur, she noticed that, during the peak of her business at running the Huffington Post, when she had so much work and put in very long hours, that she kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And eventually her energy got so low that she physically passed out with exhaustion. And that was the ultimate burnout, a wake-up call for her that it was time for her to reevaluate her life and rekindle her flame. And we've all been there at different instances where we feel just like her. I can certainly say I did when I was in business school, giving, also managing. I had a chronically ill parent and a job as well, just managing many pieces. And I felt like her at times, for sure. So with nursing, just even thinking about this past year, I'm sure you felt this way, even in spite of COVID, the family obligations, all of it contributed to kind of falling down that right side of this bell curve.
We just heard Trish reflect on Arianna Huffington's journey and relate it to her own. Take a moment to reflect on your past year or two. Where do you feel you would currently fall on the bell curve of burnout?
But what's interesting is what it does to us physically. The neurophysiological responses of burnout, very similar to a fire, similar to a trauma. So the brains of people who are chronically burnt out show similar damage as people who have experienced trauma. And the burnout reduces the connectivity between different parts of your brain, which then can result in decreased creativity, decreased working memory, and decreased problem solving. So it's really related to two areas of the brain. So know that the body runs hot during burnout. It runs hot with inflammation, and that the place in the brain that handles a stress response, known as the amygdala, flares up when we are underneath stress and trauma, and it controls our emotional reactions. It's known as the reacting part of the brain. It can cause moodiness. It can also cause you to have a stronger stress response when startled. Now, burnout also affects a different part of your brain known as the prefrontal cortex. It's the part of the brain that's responsible for cognitive functioning. It actually begins to thin, the thinking part of the brain. And this naturally happens as we age, but in people who are underneath prolonged stress for prolonged periods of time, it becomes more rapidly, it diminishes. So those parts of the brain that control our memory and attention spans are weakened. And this makes it difficult for us to learn. So the brains of people who are chronically burnt out do show those same exact damage as those people who have experienced trauma. And this reduces the connectivity between those different parts of the brain, and that we are not totally dialed into our environment. We are reacting. So think about, even just to mention, compassion fatigue versus, burnout. It's all a secondary trauma, that we are experiencing trauma of the brain, and that we are obviously affecting our stress response and how we react to the stress around us. When we are working with that amygdala, we are in a state of what's known as fight or flight. And when we are working within that prefrontal cortex realm, we are in a state which is known as the parasympathetic mode, or rest and digest, the relaxation response. And this is part of the work that Dr. Herbert Benson did at Massachusetts General Hospital. And he was a cardiologist, and he studied stress and this effect on the brain and the nervous system, and how much we have in control with our thoughts, with our actions, and our self-care of where we want to send those signals into the brain. So with some of the suggestions, what we do is we actually rewire the brain, we shrink down the amygdala, and we expand the prefrontal cortex. And that is known as neuroplasticity. It's really important. So neuroplasticity can be attained through mind-body practices, getting out in nature, walking, doing something else besides your job, even learning a new hobby, but we'll talk about those things soon. So burnout, it's a real thing. And again, we're just thinking about burnout like a candle, that at the very beginning, we are shining bright, we are lit. And over time, there are stages as we move through burnout, and they're not linear. The stages are not linear, that we might start to move between them. We might skip stages. And this particular framework was developed by Herbert Freudenberger, and he is a New York psychoanalyst. So in the 70s, he created this model, and he noticed the reason why is that his own job, which was just at one point so rewarding, he'd come to find that he felt fatigued and frustrated. And he noticed that many of the physicians around him over time also turned into, depressive cynics. They may not have had a warm relationship with their patients the way they used to. They became cold and dismissive. So Freudenberger took these examples of healthcare and found similar cases in other professions. Afflicted people suffered mood fluctuations, disturbed sleep, difficulty concentrating, and also some physical ailments as well, including backaches and digestive disorders. So Freudenberger defined burnout as a state of mental and physical exhaustion caused by one's professional life.
Trish has shared a lot of information about how our brains are wired and rewired. In this episode, we heard in depth the ways in which nurses have been impacted by the pandemic. We also learned that statistically, 1/3 of nurses are considering leaving their current jobs due to burnout. In episode 2, Trish will offer some solutions to this burnout dilemma. This is Leanna McGuire for Elite Learning by Colibri Healthcare.
This podcast featured content from an accredited CE activity provided by Colibri Healthcare. Visit elitelearning.com/podcasts for accreditation and disclosure statements and instructions on how you may be able to earn CE credits. Take your learning to the next level by subscribing to more podcasts on compelling healthcare topics.